Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into something that might seem a little, well, textbooky at first glance,
Mm,
poverty and development.
yeah.
But stick with us. Trust me, this stuff is way more exciting than it sounds, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant gearing up for that international relations paper.
Oh, absolutely.
We're about to unpack the very forces that shape our world, from global power dynamics to even those everyday choices we make.
Yeah.
Ever wondered why some nations just seem to zoom ahead while others are struggling to keep up?
Right. Well, that's exactly what we're going to be getting into today.
Yeah.
So, our deep dive today is based on excerpts from a text that really gets into the nitty-gritty of all these issues.
Okay.
Different perspectives, historical context, even some of those heated debates that make this topic so fascinating, really.
Yeah, it's funny. It's always struck me how these concepts of poverty and development,
Hmm.
they sound very academic, but they actually ripple out into our daily lives in so many ways.
Right. I mean, we see it in the headlines about global inequality. We feel it when we're, grappling with ethical choices as consumers.
Right.
It even tops up in those UPSC exam questions.
Yeah.
So understanding these dynamics
Yeah,
is really key to making sense of our interconnected world. And that's precisely what we're hoping to do today.
absolutely. So today's mission, unpack some dense but crucial stuff.
Okay.
First, we're going to tackle the very definition of poverty. Like, what do we even mean when we say that word?
Okay.
Then we'll rewind the clock a little bit, explore the historical context, how do we even get here? And finally, we'll dive into those controversial approaches to development. Now, this is where things get really interesting, especially, I think, for those future diplomats and policymakers among you.
Right, right.
Okay, so let's unpack this first challenge,
Yeah.
defining poverty. The source text we're using kind of throws out two main approaches right off the bat: absolute poverty and relative poverty. Now, absolute poverty is all about those basic needs, right?
Yeah.
Food, shelter, the essentials for survival.
Hmm.
But then we have relative poverty, which gets a little bit more, I guess, nuanced. It considers social context and inequality, meaning your poverty status could depend on where you live and who you're comparing yourself to.
Yeah.
What do you think about these two approaches?
I mean, I think you've already hit on a key debate right there. Seeing poverty solely through the lens of absolute needs, that bare minimum for survival, I think might miss the social and economic factors
Right.
that trap people in a cycle of deprivation. You think about it, someone might technically have food and shelter, but still lack access to education or healthcare, or even basic opportunities to improve their lives.
Right.
And that's where the concept of relative poverty, I think, comes in.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that poverty isn't just about survival, it's about having a fair shot at a decent life.
That's a great point. And, our source text even mentions the World Bank's famous, or maybe infamous, $1.25 a day poverty line,
Yeah.
which, it's an attempt to create this global benchmark
Right.
for, absolute poverty. But can a single number really capture such a complex issue? I mean, what are the challenges of setting a universal poverty line like this?
Hmm.
Especially, I'm thinking for a UPSC aspirant who is trying to grasp the nuances of global development.
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. Trying to sum up the diverse realities of poverty with a single number. I mean, it's a massive challenge. For starters, a dollar has a wildly different purchasing power,
Right.
depending on where you are in the world. I mean, what might be a poverty level income in one country
Yeah.
could be considered relatively comfortable in another. But the problem actually goes even deeper than that.
Oh.
Remember Amartya Sen, that brilliant economist and philosopher?
Right.
He argued that poverty isn't just about, a lack of income. It's about lacking capabilities and freedoms,
Right.
the ability to participate in society, access education and healthcare, and make choices that shape your own life.
So, if we can't just rely on a simple income threshold, how do we measure something as multifaceted as poverty?
Right.
Especially in worlds where, the UPSC expects you to analyze global development trends.
That's a question that has puzzled policymakers and development experts for decades, really.
Yeah.
And that's why we have these alternative measures,
Yeah.
like the UN's Human Development Index, which factors in things like life expectancy, education levels, and even gender equality. It tries to give a more holistic picture of well-being that goes beyond just economic indicators.
Okay. So we started to see how tricky it is to even just define poverty.
Right.
But now let's do a little bit of time travel. Our source text claims that for most of human history, Poverty was actually the norm, not the exception.
Mm.
It even throws out this term, the Malthusian trap. The idea that population growth
Right.
would constantly outstrip our ability to produce food
Yeah.
and would keep most of humanity stuck in this cycle of poverty. Can you paint a picture of what life was like back then, before this whole concept of development even emerged?
Well, imagine a world without modern technology or medicine or those intricate trade networks
Right.
that bring us goods from all over the globe. For centuries, most societies relied on agriculture, but without the modern farming techniques that, we just take for granted.
Right.
So productivity was limited, life expectancy was short, and even, the elites lived in a way that we would probably consider impoverished today. Poverty wasn't an exception. It was the backdrop of human existence.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to the world we live in now, especially for those of us lucky enough to be living in developed nations.
Hmm.
But as our source points out, this relative affluence is a pretty recent phenomenon, largely tied to the Industrial Revolution,
Mm.
which, that kicked off in the West.
Hmm.
How did this period change the game? And how did it lead to the very idea of development as we understand it today?
Well, the Industrial Revolution was a pivotal moment.
Right.
It wasn't just about new machines and factories. It
Mhm.
was a fundamental shift in how we produced goods
Yeah.
and generated wealth, really. Suddenly, thanks to innovations like the steam engine, mechanization, productivity just skyrocketed in the West.
Yeah.
And with that came this rapid increase in wealth and living standards.
Mhm.
But here's the catch.
Okay.
This progress wasn't evenly distributed.
Right.
It created this huge gap between the industrialized West
Yeah.
and the rest of the world.
And that's where this whole idea of development as like a catch-up game
Yeah.
comes into play, right?
Exactly.
Suddenly, it's not just about surviving. It's about emulating the West's economic success, often measured solely by that, magic number, GDP. But as our source text hints, this Western-centric model of development has a dark side too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You can't talk about development without acknowledging the shadow of colonialism.
Right.
European powers were busy extracting resources and labor from their colonies, often hindering the very development that they claim to promote.
Right. Yeah.
And, this legacy of exploitation continues to shape global power dynamics today.
So this begs the question, can Western-style development even be replicated globally? And should it be the goal in the first place? Especially when we consider those ongoing debates about neo-colonialism and the subtle ways that power imbalances still influence international relations today.
I mean, those are the million-dollar questions at the heart of development studies, really.
Yeah.
And they're not easy to answer.
Yeah.
We need to critically examine
Yeah.
whether a model built on industrialization and relentless economic growth
Right.
is sustainable for the entire planet, especially given the environmental challenges we face today.
Okay, so we've established that development is this complex
Right.
and loaded term, really deeply intertwined with history and power dynamics. Now let's roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty of those different approaches to development
Okay.
and all the controversies that they spark. Really,
Right.
our source text specifically mentions some big players like the World Bank and the IMF, but it also acknowledges the criticisms that they face.
Yeah.
What are some of those dominant development paradigms that have emerged over the years, and what are the key arguments for and against them?
Well, this is where things get really fascinating.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum of approaches out there, each with its own champions and critics.
Right.
So let's start with the market-oriented approach.
Okay.
Often championed by institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. It's all about free trade, privatization, letting market forces drive economic growth. The idea is that you create a business-friendly environment. Investment will pour in.
You're right.
Economies will take off, and the benefits will eventually trickle down to everyone.
But I've got to imagine there are some pretty strong counter arguments to this approach as well, right?
Yeah.
It sounds a little too good to be true. What are some of the criticisms leveled at this market-driven model?
Well, critics argue that this model often ends up, widening the gap between the rich and the poor, both within and between countries.
Right.
They point out that the benefits of economic growth often concentrate in the hands of a few,
Right.
while the majority might see little improvement
Right.
in their lives.
So it's not just about growth, it's about how that growth is distributed
Exactly.
and who it benefits.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
What other approaches to development have gained traction as alternatives to this purely
Yeah.
market-driven model?
Well, there's a growing movement towards, more sustainable and equitable
Hmm.
models of development.
Right.
Some advocate for, increased foreign aid to developing countries,
Mm.
targeting investments in crucial areas like education, healthcare, infrastructure.
Mm.
The idea is to provide a boost and help these countries
Yeah.
build the foundations for long-term development.
And of course, there's the ongoing debate about debt cancellation.
Hmm.
The argument is that by relieving developing nations of their massive debts,
Right.
we can free up resources that can then be channeled towards poverty reduction and development initiatives.
Precisely. Proponents of debt cancellation see it as a moral imperative,
Mm.
arguing that it's time for wealthy nations, many of whom benefited from colonial exploitation,
Right.
to help level the playing field. They point out that these debts were often incurred
Right.
under unfair conditions,
Right.
trapping countries in this cycle of repayment
Yeah.
that hinders their ability to invest in their own people.
Yeah. But I bet there's another side to the story too, right? What are some of the concerns raised by those who were skeptical of debt cancellation?
Sure. Opponents worry about creating a moral hazard,
Okay.
essentially rewarding irresponsible behavior. They argue that if countries know that their debts will be forgiven,
Hmm.
they might be, less inclined
Yeah.
to manage their finances prudently
Right.
in the future.
And there are also those concerns about, the potential for corruption,
Right.
where forgiven funds
Yeah.
might end up lining the pockets of corrupt officials
Yeah.
instead of reaching the intended beneficiaries.
Exactly.
It sounds like there are no easy answers here.
Sure.
Every approach comes with its own set of complexities and potential downsides.
Hmm.
This brings up, I think, a crucial ethical dimension to development work, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Do wealthy nations have a moral obligation
Mm.
to assist developing countries? And if so, what should that assistance look like?
Right.
Should it be financial aid,
Right.
technology transfer,
Yeah.
fair trade practices,
Mhm.
or a combination of all of the above? It's a question that's been debated for decades,
Yeah.
and it's at the heart of many international relations challenges.
It's a question that goes beyond just economics
Mm.
and touches on fundamental ideas of justice and global solidarity.
Right.
How do we reconcile those historical inequalities with the need to create a more equitable world? It's a complex challenge, and there's no, one size fits all answer.
I think we need to pause here for a moment.
Okay.
And let our listeners, especially those prepping for the UPSC, absorb all this information.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from defining poverty, exploring its historical roots,
Right.
to dissecting the various approaches to development and the controversies that they spark.
Right. Right.
When we come back, we'll wrap up this deep dive with some final thoughts and key takeaways. But for now, I encourage you to think about how these concepts connect to current events and global power dynamics.
Sure.
How do they influence foreign policy decisions and the work of international organizations? And how might you apply these insights to, tackle those challenging UPSC exam questions?
Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive.
We've been on quite a journey today, exploring this intricate world of poverty and development.
Yeah.
From those tricky definitions to those historical forces that got us here, and even those heated debates about how to tackle these global challenges. It's a lot to take in, I know, but stick with us. Understanding these issues is crucial for anyone who wants to make sense of the world,
Okay.
especially for our ambitious UPSC aspirants out there.
Absolutely.
Whether you're prepping for those tough exams or just navigating life as an informed citizen, these insights are pure gold.
Absolutely. One of the most important things I think we've uncovered today is that there's no one-size-fits-all definition of poverty.
Right.
It's not just about income.
Mm.
It's about access to opportunities, resources,
Mhm.
and even freedom to make choices that shape your own life. It's multidimensional, which makes measuring it accurately incredibly tricky.
Thinking back to that World Bank poverty line of $1.25 a day,
Right.
it's a useful starting point, I guess, for global comparisons,
Yeah.
but it definitely doesn't capture the full picture.
Mhm.
And for our UPSC folks out there, remember that the exam might throw those numbers at you,
Mhm.
but it's your job to go beyond those simple metrics and demonstrate a deeper understanding of what poverty really means.
Exactly. And as we explored earlier, poverty wasn't always the human default setting.
Right.
This whole concept of development is relatively new, born out of the Industrial Revolution and those massive inequalities it created between the West and the rest of the world. Understanding this historical context is key to analyzing today's global power dynamics.
Which brings us to another crucial takeaway.
Yeah.
Development itself is a loaded term,
Hmm.
often shaped by Western perspectives, and those lingering legacies of colonialism.
Mhm.
We need to be critical of the assumption that there's only one path to progress. Maybe it's time to explore alternative models that prioritize sustainability,
Yeah.
equity, and respect for diverse cultures and values.
And when it comes to those models, the debates are far from settled.
Yeah.
We've touched on market-oriented approaches championed by institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, but we've also seen the criticisms they face. Then there are those who advocate for increased foreign aid, debt cancellation, fair trade practices, each with its own set of, passionate advocates and fierce critics.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, right?
It is, yeah.
But as we've seen, understanding these debates,
Yeah,
the historical context, the ethical dilemmas, the potential trade-offs
right.
is essential for anyone who wants to engage with these issues thoughtfully. Whether you're a future policymaker, an activist, or just someone who cares about creating a more just and equitable world. This knowledge is power.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. As you continue your own explorations, think about a role of globalization, technology, and climate change. These are game changers that are constantly reshaping the landscape of poverty and development.
Hmm.
So, don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, and keep asking those tough questions.
So what resonated most with you today? What new insights are you taking away? We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity.
Yeah.
And given you a solid foundation for understanding these complex issues. And hey, if you're prepping for the UPSC, you just might find some of this popping up in those exam questions.
Right.
If you found this deep dive helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of fascinating topics. We're here to help you navigate the complexities of our world, one deep dive at a time. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.